This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On this International Women's Day, we turn now to historic new protections for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault in the United States. On Thursday, President Obama signed an expanded reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act that includes new provisions for Native American and LGBT survivors. The original Violence Against Women Act was first passed in 1994 and drafted by, well, now Vice President Joe Biden. It lapsed in 2011 for the first time in its nearly 20-year history, after Republicans blocked it over the new protections. But the Republican-led House finally passed the bill last week. Obama spoke during a signing ceremony at the Interior Department on Thursday.
Because this is a country where everybody should be able to pursue their own measure of happiness and live their lives free from fear, no matter who you are, no matter who you love. That's got to be our priority. That's what today's about. Today is about the millions of women, the victims of domestic abuse and sexual assault, who are out there right now looking for a lifeline, looking for support. Because of this bill, they'll continue to have access to all the services that Joe first helped establish 19 years ago. National hotline, network of shelters, protection orders that carry across state lines. And because of this bill, we're also expanding housing assistance so that no woman has to choose between a violent home and no home at all. That's what today's all about.
The updated Violence Against Women Act authorizes hundreds of millions of dollars annually for domestic violence programs. It also issues new rules for handling violence on college campuses, where 1 in 5 women will be a victim of sexual assault or attempted sexual assault during her time there. It adds stalking to the list of crimes that make undocumented immigrants eligible for protection. For the first time ever, it specifically includes gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender survivors. And in a landmark addition, it empowers tribal authorities to prosecute non-Native Americans for abuses committed on tribal lands. Diane Milich, a domestic violence survivor from the Southern Ute tribe in Colorado, introduced Vice President Biden at Thursday's signing ceremony by telling her own story.
When I was 26 years old, I dated a non-Indian, a white man. After 6 months, we were married. My non-Indian husband moved into my house on the reservation. To my shock, just days after our marriage, he assaulted me. After a year of abuse and more than 100 incidences of being slapped, kicked, punched, and living in horrific terror, I left for good. During that year of marriage, I called the police many times. I called our Southern Ute Tribal Police Department, but the law prevented them from arresting and prosecuting my husband because he was non-Indian. The county sheriff could not help me because I am a Native woman and the beatings occurred on tribal reservation land. After one beating, my ex-husband called the tribal police and the sheriff's department himself just to show me that no one could stop him. All the times that I called the police and nothing was done only made my ex-husband believe he was above the law and untouchable. My ex-husband told me, "You promised us until death do us part, so death it shall be." Finally, he arrived at my office armed with a gun. I am alive today only because my coworker pushed me out of harm's way and took the bullet in his shoulder. For this crime, he was finally arrested. But because he had never been arrested for any of the abuse against me, he was treated as a first-time offender. The state prosecutor and him reached a plea agreement of aggravated driving under revocation. If the bill being signed today were law when I was married, it would have allowed my tribe to arrest and prosecute my abuser. When this bill is signed, the Violence Against Women Act will finally reach Native American women like me.
That was Diane Milich of the Southern Ute tribe in Colorado speaking Thursday at the signing ceremony for the Violence Against Women Act. To talk more about the expansion of the law, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by 2 guests who were at that ceremony. Juana Mahal Dixon is the first vice president of the National Congress of American Indians and co-chair of the group's task force on violence against women. She serves on the Legislative Council for the Palma tribe in San Diego County, California. Mara Kiesling is a transgender rights activist, founding executive director of the National Center for Transgender Equality. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! I want to begin with Juana. If you can talk about the significance of this act, the Violence Against Women Act, for Native American women. If you could follow up on the story we just heard.
Oh my gosh, being in that room, listening to her, and I've known Diane for a few years now, and hearing her story the first time, knew that we had to make a difference. And the women across this country, as allies, the National Task Force, and our tribal women, we knew every breath, every step we made was to make sure that we could affect change to protect our Native women who chose to be in relationship with non-Native spouses and protect them from the violence that we did not know was happening on such a scale until we began to listen and hear, and we realized we had to change the law so that they could be protected with just protection orders and the right for our tribal police to come in and remove them and to alleviate the harm and the pain that was being caused. The impact, you could hear it in the room, but it was palatable. The rhythm of the heart was so strong of the women in this nation that when we breathed out the Lulus that you sound when you're excited and you praise Creator's will that this has been done in a good way.
Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa was one of 22 Republicans who voted against the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization bill when it passed in the Senate. He generated controversy, including a letter of condemnation from your task force, Juana, when he explained his reasoning at an Iowa town hall meeting.
You get non-Indians going into a reservation and violating a woman. They need to be prosecuted. They aren't prosecuted. So the idea behind this bill is we'll try them in tribal court. But under the laws of our land, you've got to have a jury that is a reflection of society as a whole, and on an Indian reservation, it's going to be made up of Indians, right? So the non-Indian doesn't get a fair trial.
That was Republican Senator Chuck Grassley. Some Republicans had used a constitutional argument to object to the expansion of protections for Native American women. This is Republican Senator John Cornyn of Texas speaking against the expansion on the Senate floor last month.
This is a bill that could do so much good in the battle for victims' rights, but unfortunately it's being held hostage by a single provision that would take away fundamental constitutional rights for certain American citizens. And for what? For what? In order to satisfy the unconstitutional demands of special interests.
Juana Mahal-Duxon, your response.
There's a couple of reasons. We took a letter to Grassley to let him know that our selection that we would use to help in a prosecution would be fair, that the community we come from, by nature of the fact that we have intermarried with our non-Indian partners, they would be a part of that, plus our community. We have plans to, because we live side by side with non-Indian communities throughout Indian country, as well as our tribal groups within our territories. There's a natural blend of coexisting together that it seems logical and sensible that we would somehow have the same kind of faith, same kind of trust to give fair and just decisions in terms of a case. We also know that there's an appeal system in it that they could choose to go to a federal court, but there's a process. In terms of what was said of the unconstitutional piece, it's very hard to realize that inside the Constitution itself, we exist. We're part of the Founding Fathers' language of this country, and our relationship with them is sovereign to sovereign, or essentially government to government. And in that relationship, if you don't know that, and if you're not taught that, you just don't know. And you can't get angry at what they don't know, but you can try to help them to understand that it isn't unconstitutional. We even have the Indian Civil Rights Act, which mirrors several provisions that are in the Civil Rights Act that allow, as you know, the protections for in a case for prosecution and defendant, that this this outline is in there, that we wouldn't deviate from it just because we now have this opportunity. Only seems logical that the safety and wellness of any society would be given at least fair measure to affect change for that kind of protection, and this affords that. And I understand, I'll tell you again, I understand if they didn't know, the way that they do know is because they didn't learn how the Constitution were a part of it. And I don't want to repeat myself, but I think I said what I needed to say there.
I want to bring Mara Kiesling into the conversation, head of the National Center for Transgender Equality. Talk about the significance of this legislation, Mara.
Well, it's hugely significant. LGBT people, including transgender people, are frequently victims of domestic and sexual violence at levels equal, at least equal to other people in society. But we're much more likely to face discrimination when trying to access services. And like a lot of other populations, like immigrant women populations, like American Indian populations, we're often less likely to seek assistance either from the police or from the services that are available for violence victims, because maybe we don't think we'll be treated fairly. Maybe we feel like we'll lose our right to be here in the country. When you're at the intersection of these things, for instance, if you're a transgender immigrant or a transgender undocumented immigrant, you can imagine the fear of accessing these services. But we see now people being turned away from domestic violence programs, including shelters, specifically because they're lesbians or gay or transgender or bisexual. And something Juana said that is really true here, a lot of this is just about ignorance. And while the Violence Against Women's Act is largely about creating the services and funding the services, it's also very important as an educational moment to understand, to make America understand, and to make violence programs even understand that LGBT people do face violence and do need services, that immigrant women can be held hostage by people for whom people who have control over their right to be here, and by the way, to educate the American population that tribal courts do justice and are fair places where people can expect to get justice.
Mara, can you talk about the organizing of the trans, the gay, the lesbian, the bisexual community around this, around achieving inclusion in the Violence Against Women Act?
Sure. There were a lot of really great folks who led the charge here. The Anti-Violence Project, the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center was great, the Human Rights Campaign, a lot of groups that really were able to organize our community and to work with other communities. I want to talk about the National Task Force and the amazing work that task force, which included lots of different kinds of communities and activists, did. Our job was to make sure our people understood the significance of this. To transgender people, that was specifically our role. And the other groups, really stepped up. And I think it was a really great model for how different advocacy communities can work together to get something done that matters to all of us, and against people who, or I should say in response to people who are just against it because of the type of people it would protect. So
Mara, as we wrap up, this is the second ever LGBTQ inclusive legislation. What was the first?
The Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act, which has been a significant thing. This is also the first time that sexual orientation and gender identity are explicitly protected in anti-discrimination protections in federal law.
Well, Mara, I want to thank you for joining us on this International Women's Day, part of the array of voices that we hear. A transgender woman, head of the National Center for Transgender Equality, and Juana Mahal Dixon of the National Congress of American Indians. We end with the words of one Congresswoman. Late last month, before the House approved the Senate version of the Violence Against Women Act, Wisconsin Democratic Congressmember Gwen Moore gave an impassioned speech against Republican efforts to block its expanded protections. We're going to end with that clip.
I pray that this body will do as the Senate has done and come together as one to protect all women from violence. I would just, as I think about the LGBT victims that are not here, the Native women who are not here, the immigrants who are not included in this bill, I would say, as Sojourner Truth would say, ain't they women? They deserve protections. When we talk about the constitutional rights, don't women on tribal lands deserve the constitutional right of equal protection and not to be raped and battered and beaten and dragged back onto native lands because they know they're raped with impunity? Ain't they women? And I would yield back the balance of my time.
Wisconsin Democratic Congressmember Gwen Moore speaking for the Violence Against Women Act and its expanded protections of the Native American and transgender gay lesbian community. This is democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.